That transfer carries a forged seal, and I will prove it today." George Donovan's voice cut through the stale air of the Cutter's Creek land office like a blade through canvas, and every soul in that cramped, sun-baked room went still as death. The deputy's badge on his chest caught the afternoon light slanting through the dirty window, throwing a silver gleam across the rough wooden walls, and his dark eyes locked onto the land agent with the kind of cold certainty that made lesser men step backward involuntarily. Silas Pratt, the land agent in question, was a man who had built his entire career on knowing exactly how much sweat and desperation it took before a person cracked under pressure. He was thick-necked and pale beneath a mottled complexion, with small eyes that darted like trapped insects behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He held the transfer document in both hands, and those hands, George noted with grim satisfaction, were trembling. "Deputy Donovan," Pratt said, his voice sliding into an oiled, professional register that barely concealed the panic underneath, "I would counsel you very carefully before making accusations of that nature in a public space. This document was filed according to territorial law, witnessed by 2 parties, and sealed by the county clerk. Any suggestion that it is fraudulent could constitute slander against a legally recognized instrument of save the speech for someone who didn't spend 3 years in the territorial surveyor's office," George said, stepping closer. He did not reach for his gun. He did not need to. The presence he carried in that room was something older and more dangerous than iron and powder. "I know what the county clerk's seal looks like. I have seen it on 50 documents. And I know what it looks like when someone has pressed a homemade replica into warm wax and hoped nobody would look twice." The room was small, but it was not empty. 3 other men stood along the far wall, settlers by the look of them, their hats in their hands and their faces worn down to something close to hopelessness. And then there was Winifred Abbott. She stood near the door, her back straight and her chin lifted at an angle that spoke of a woman who had learned long ago that the world would only give her as much dignity as she was willing to demand for herself. She wore a dark blue traveling dress, practical and plain, with the hem still carrying the red dust of the Cutter's Creek Road. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a modest hat, and her eyes, which were a deep amber brown that caught the light in unexpected ways, were fixed on George Donovan with an expression that was equal parts desperation and fierce, barely contained hope. She had been waiting in this office for 2 hours. She had ridden 37 miles through July heat to get here. And the piece of paper that Silas Pratt was clutching in his shaking hands was, according to that same Silas Pratt, the legal proof that the 160 acres her father had homesteaded, worked, and died on now belonged to a land development company called Meridian Holdings, which existed, as far as anyone in Cutter's Creek could determine, only on paper. This was not the beginning of the story. The beginning had been 3 weeks ago, on a Tuesday morning when a notice had arrived nailed to the front door of the Abbott homestead. Winifred had been standing at the kitchen table when her neighbor, old Walt Ferris, came pounding up the porch steps with the look of a man delivering a death sentence. She remembered the way the nails had been driven, carelessly, so that the paper had torn slightly at one corner, fluttering in the hot wind like a wounded bird. She remembered reading the notice 3 times before the words arranged themselves into something she could understand, and then she had sat down on the porch steps and placed her hands in her lap, and looked out at the 40 acres of winter wheat her father had planted in the last autumn before his heart gave out, and she had made herself a promise. She would not lose this land. Her father, Edmund Abbott, had come to the New Mexico Territory in 1876 with $40, a mule, and enough stubbornness to shame a mountain. He had filed his homestead claim under the Homestead Act of 1862, proved it up in the required 5 years, and received his final certificate from the General Land Office in 1881. He had shown Winifred that certificate when she was 14 years old, holding it out to her like it was something sacred, and she supposed it was. It was the physical manifestation of every impossible thing he had managed to do. He had died in the spring of 1884. Winifred was 23 years old, and she had been running the homestead alone since then, with the help of 2 hired hands who had known her father and stayed out of loyalty as much as wages. She had kept the mortgage payments on the small equipment loan current. She had sold enough wheat and raised enough cattle to keep the operation in the black, barely, but in the black. And then the notice had come, and the world had rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. The notice claimed that a land transfer, dated March 15, 1884, had conveyed the Abbott homestead property to Meridian Holdings, a land development enterprise. The transfer document, according to the notice, had been filed with the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe and recorded locally in Cutter's Creek. If Winifred wished to contest the claim, she had 30 days to appear before the local land agent, one Silas Pratt, with evidence of her counterclaim. 30 days. The notice had been nailed to her door 6 days before she found it, while she had been in the south pasture dealing with a fence line that a spring storm had collapsed. So she had 24 days. She had spent the first 3 days writing letters to the county clerk, to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, to the General Land Office. She received one response in the time she had left, from the county clerk's office, informing her that yes, the transfer had been recorded, and that the recording carried a seal from the county clerk's office, and that no one in the county clerk's office had any record of how that seal had come to be affixed to a document that none of them had processed. That was the crack in the wall. Winifred had taken that letter and her father's original land certificate, which she had kept in a tin box under the floorboard of the bedroom, and she had ridden to Cutter's Creek. She had gone first to the sheriff's office, because she was practical and she was not naive, and she understood that the legal machinery that was being used against her was sophisticated enough to require someone with authority to dismantle it. The sheriff, a man named Beaumont who was cordial and competent in matters of cattle theft and barroom disturbances, had listened to her with the particular quality of attention that men gave to women they considered distressed rather than credible. He had offered her water. He had expressed sympathy. He had told her that matters of land title were civil affairs and outside his immediate jurisdiction, and he had suggested she consult an attorney. There were 2 attorneys in Cutter's Creek. One had been retained by Meridian Holdings 3 months prior, which Winifred discovered when she arrived at his office. The other had left town the previous week to attend to a family illness in Albuquerque and was not expected to return for a month. She had stood on the main street of Cutter's Creek in the midday heat, with her horse tied to the rail outside the attorney's office, and the full weight of her situation pressing down on her like the July sun itself. And she had thought about what her father had told her once, during a hard winter, when a neighbor's dispute over water rights had threatened to consume half the valley. "Winifred," he had said, "when the law fails to protect you, find the person who believes in the law enough to make it work when it doesn't want to." She had looked up and down the street, and she had seen the deputy. George Donovan was not the most obvious person to turn to for help. He was 31 years old, lean and dark-haired, with a face that had been weathered into sharp planes by years of outdoor work, and he wore his deputy's badge with the air of a man who took the responsibility seriously but did not perform it. He was outside the feed store talking to the proprietor, and he was listening more than he was speaking, which struck Winifred as unusual enough to be interesting. She had approached him directly because she had not come this far to be indirect. "Deputy," she had said, "my name is Winifred Abbott. My father's homestead has been claimed by a land development company on the basis of a transfer document I believe to be fraudulent, and I have 23 days to prove it. I have been to the sheriff, both attorneys, and the county clerk's office, and I am out of obvious options. I would like your help." George Donovan had turned and looked at her with those dark, watchful eyes, and she had the distinct impression that he was measuring the exact distance between what she was saying and what she was not saying, and finding the gap to be truthfully narrow. "Tell me about the document," he had said. That had been 3 weeks ago. In the time since, George Donovan had done something that surprised Winifred, though she would not have admitted it to him immediately. He had believed her. Not in the conditional, "let me look into this" way that she had come to expect from men in positions of authority, but with a decisive, operational certainty that rearranged his priorities without hesitation. He had asked to see her father's original land certificate that same afternoon. He had ridden with her to the homestead to examine the physical boundaries of the property against the survey markers. He had written 3 letters of his own to territorial offices, using the weight of his deputy's badge as leverage, where hers as a private citizen had produced only silence. And he had spent the better part of 2 weeks digging into the history of Meridian Holdings with the quiet, methodical intensity of a man who had learned that most secrets were not buried very deep. They just required someone patient enough and angry enough to look. What he had found was a thread, and when he pulled it, the whole fabric began to unravel. Meridian Holdings had been incorporated in the territory of New Mexico in February of 1884, 6 weeks before the supposed land transfer from Edmund Abbott. Its registered agent was a man named Colton Briggs, who was also, as it happened, the silent business partner of Silas Pratt, the Cutters Creek land agent. Briggs operated out of Las Cruces, where he had a reputation as a man who understood how territorial land records worked and how to make them work in his favor. He had been involved in 3 other disputed land claims in the territory over the previous 2 years, all of which had been settled quietly, which George had come to understand meant that the original landowners had run out of money or energy before they ran out of time. The seal on the transfer document was the crucial piece. George had obtained, through a contact in the territorial surveyor's office in Santa Fe, a set of certified impressions of the county clerk's official seal as it had appeared on documents filed between 1880 and 1884. He had also obtained, from a clerk in the Cutters Creek courthouse who had grown visibly uncomfortable when asked about the transfer filing, a physical impression of the seal as it appeared on the Abbott transfer document. The differences were small, but they were real. The outer ring of the official seal carried 22 evenly spaced stars. The seal on the transfer document carried 20 stars, unevenly spaced, as if the person who had made the replica had been working from memory or a rough sketch rather than the original. It was the kind of detail that would be overlooked by anyone who was not specifically looking for it. George had been specifically looking for it. He had arrived at the land office that afternoon with the 2 seal impressions, with a sworn affidavit from the territorial surveyor's contact, with the letter from the county clerk's office acknowledging that no one there had processed the transfer, and with 3 years of accumulated fury at the kind of hidden betrayal that stripped hardworking people of everything they had built. Because this was not, for George Donovan, purely a professional matter. It was personal in ways he had not told Winifred yet, and the weight of those untold things sat in his chest like a stone throughout those 3 weeks as he watched her fight for her land with a determination that he found, against his careful professional intentions, increasingly impossible to regard with detachment. His own family had lost a farm. Not to forged documents, but to debt and drought, and the particular cruelty of a banker who had called a loan at the worst possible moment. In 1873, when George was 20 years old, and his father was already sick, and his mother was trying to hold 3 younger siblings together with what was left after the harvest failed. They had walked away from the only home George had ever known and scattered across the territory, and he had become a lawman partly because he needed a living and partly because he had decided, with the bone-deep conviction of a young man who had been betrayed by a system that was supposed to protect people, that he would spend whatever years he had making sure that system worked for the people it was supposed to protect. Watching Winifred Abbott refuse to bend under circumstances that would have broken most people was doing something complicated to his internal architecture, and he was professional enough to acknowledge it to himself even while he was disciplined enough to keep it from affecting his work. But he was not, he discovered as those weeks passed, quite disciplined enough to stop thinking about her. She had that quality of stillness that some people carried, the kind that was not passivity but concentration, as if every ounce of energy was directed toward whatever needed doing rather than scattered across the landscape of worry. She was practical in the way that people who have done real physical work are practical, knowing exactly how long it takes to do a thing, and not wasting time on the fantasy of it taking less. She was also, he noticed, funny, with a dry precision to her humor that emerged in unexpected moments and suggested a richness of inner life that the circumstances of the last few weeks had been doing their best to suppress. She had appeared at the sheriff's office on a Wednesday morning, 8 days into their collaboration, with a tin of biscuits she had made the previous evening and an expression that dared him to make anything sentimental of it. "You have been working on my behalf without compensation for over a week," she had said, setting the tin on his desk with the matter-of-fact air of completing a transaction. "I am aware that hospitality is the currency of the territory when money is scarce. These are the best biscuits in the county, according to my father, who was not a man given to exaggeration." George had looked at the tin and then at her and said, "I haven't had a decent biscuit since March." "Then you are welcome," she had said, and sat down in the chair across from his desk and opened her own copy of the county deed records to the page she had been working through, and they had spent the next 2 hours in companionable, purposeful silence, broken only by the occasional exchange of relevant information. He had thought about that morning several times since, with a warmth that he kept very firmly in the professional compartment of his mind. Now, standing in the land office with Silas Pratt's trembling hands and 3 desperate settlers watching from the wall, George set his evidence on the counter with the deliberate care of a man who had waited a long time for this moment. 2 seal impressions, he said, laying the first document down. The one on the left is a certified impression of the county clerk's official seal, obtained from the Territorial Surveyor's Archive in Santa Fe. The one on the right is taken from the transfer document filed on behalf of Meridian Holdings. Count the stars in the outer ring. Pratt's small eyes moved between the 2 documents. His mouth opened and closed without producing words. 22, George said, tapping the left impression. And 20, he tapped the right. The spacing on the right impression is also inconsistent. The star at the 7 o'clock position is approximately 1/16 of an inch further from the adjacent star than the others. That is the error that occurs when someone creates a seal by hand rather than by the mechanical process used to manufacture the original. This is, Pratt started. Additionally, George continued, I have a sworn affidavit from Jacob Mercer of the Territorial Surveyor's Office confirming that this discrepancy is consistent with a counterfeit seal impression. I have a letter from the county clerk's office stating that no record exists of a clerk processing this transfer. And I have the original land certificate issued to Edmund Abbott in 1881 by the General Land Office, proving clear title prior to the supposed transfer date. He looked up at Pratt and his voice dropped to something quiet and absolute. The transfer document is forged, the seal is counterfeit, and the land belonging to Miss Winifred Abbott is hers by legal right. You are going to stamp this claim void, you are going to enter that notation in the permanent record, and you are going to do it right now, in front of these witnesses. Winifred had not moved from her position near the door. She was watching George with an expression she could not entirely control, something fierce and grateful, and complicated that she was grateful he was too focused on Pratt to see clearly. Pratt looked at the documents. He looked at the settlers along the wall. He looked at the badge on George's chest and the steadiness in George's eyes, and he made the calculation that men in his position always eventually made when the evidence against them was clear, and the law was standing 3 feet away. He stamped the document void. He entered the notation in the record. He signed his name to it with a hand that had not stopped trembling. The 3 settlers against the wall exchanged glances. One of them, a young man with sun-cracked skin and the beginning of a beard, pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. Winifred walked to the counter. She picked up her father's land certificate, which George had set aside from the evidence pile. She held it in both hands for a moment, looking at her father's name written in the formal copperplate of the General Land Office, and she breathed. "Thank you," she said to George. Her voice was level and controlled, but her eyes were not. He looked at her, and the professional compartment in his mind developed a significant structural crack. "Come on," he said. "We still need to get this filed with the territorial office." Outside, the July heat hit them like an open furnace door, and the street of Cutter's Creek went about its business with the cheerful indifference of a world that had not just watched something important happen. There were wagons and horses, and the sound of a hammer from the direction of the livery. Somewhere down the street, someone was playing a fiddle badly but enthusiastically. George walked beside Winifred toward the telegraph office, which was the fastest way to get word to Santa Fe, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Winifred said, "You knew about the stars before you walked in there." "Yes. You've had that evidence for at least 4 days. 3, he said. "Why did you wait until today?" He was quiet for a few steps. "I needed the affidavit from Mercer. It arrived yesterday on the afternoon stage." She nodded. This was true, and they both knew it was also not the complete answer, and she did not press further because she was wise enough to know that some truths arrived in their own time. What she did not know, because George had not told her, was that he had also spent those 3 days doing something else, building the case against Colt and Briggs. Because nullifying the Abbott transfer was the necessary thing, but it was not sufficient. Briggs had done this before. He would do it again. He had 3 other contested claims in the territory, and there were almost certainly families in the same position as Winifred, people who had not found anyone willing to dig hard enough or far enough to expose what was being done to them. George had written, in addition to his letters to territorial offices, a letter to the United States Marshal for the New Mexico Territory. He had laid out the full case against Briggs and Pratt, the pattern of fraudulent transfers, the forged seal, the involvement of a legal professional in a scheme designed to strip homesteaders of land they had lawfully claimed and proved. He had been specific, thorough, and careful, because he knew that the case had to be airtight or Briggs would find a way to wriggle free. The marshal's response had arrived that morning, 2 hours before George walked into the land office. A deputy marshal would be in Cutter's Creek within the week. George had read that letter standing in the doorway of the sheriff's office, with the morning light coming across the mesa in long gold bars, and he had felt the satisfaction of a man who has done a hard thing correctly. Then he had put the letter in his breast pocket, pinned his badge straight, and walked to the land office. He had not yet told Winifred about the marshal. He told her now, standing outside the telegraph office, as the fiddle player down the street found his way to something approximating a melody. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about her that he had come to admire deeply over these 3 weeks. She had the capacity to absorb information without immediately fragmenting into reaction, to let a thing fully arrive before she responded to it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Briggs will know by tonight," she said. "Pratt will send word." "Yes. Will he run?" "He might try." George looked down the street. "But I've already sent word to the sheriff in Las Cruces. And the marshal's office has been watching Briggs's movements for the past week, at my request." She looked at him then with an expression that was so direct and so unguarded that he had to make a conscious effort to hold her gaze without looking away. It was the expression of someone seeing a thing clearly for the first time, not the thing itself, which she had been looking at for 3 weeks, but what it meant. "You have been 3 steps ahead of all of this," she said. "The entire time." "I've been trying to be," he said. "It seemed important." "Why?" There was a pause, and in that pause the fiddle player down the street did something genuinely good, a sweet, sliding phrase that landed perfectly, and then was immediately followed by a catastrophic wrong note that made both of them look up involuntarily, and then they both laughed, and the laughter broke something open in the air between them. "Because it mattered," George said when they had recovered. "What was being done to your family mattered, and because he stopped, she waited." "Because you matter," he said, with the careful precision of a man choosing words like he is stepping across stones in a fast-moving river. "And I found that I could not be indifferent to either of those things." Winifred looked at him. The sun was behind her and it lit the edges of her dark hair and the amber of her eyes, and George thought about the way she had set that tin of biscuits on his desk 8 days ago with such studied practicality, as if daring the moment to become more than she could afford to let it be. "You should send that telegraph," she said, "to Santa Fe." "Yes," he agreed. They sent the telegraph. They walked back to the sheriff's office, where Winifred had left her horse, and the sheriff himself was back from wherever he had been, and when George laid out what had happened at the land office in concise, factual terms, Beaumont had the grace to look genuinely abashed. "I should have looked harder," Beaumont said. "You didn't have the seal impressions," George said, which was true and also generous, and Beaumont knew both things. Winifred collected her horse. She had a 37-mile ride ahead of her, and the afternoon was already past its peak, and George was very aware that the sun would be low before she was halfway home. "You should stay in town," he said. "The hotel is." "I know where the hotel is," she said. "I've been staying there for 3 weeks. He looked at her. She was checking the saddle girth with efficient hands, not looking at him. "Then I'll ride with you tomorrow," he said. "I need to formally document the claim void at the homestead site anyway, for the territorial record." She paused in her saddle checking. "That is a very practical reason to ride 37 miles. "I am a very practical man," he said. She looked at him over the horse's back, and there was something in her expression that was very nearly a smile, and then it became actually a smile, warm and real and unguarded in a way he had not seen from her before, and it did significant damage to his composure. "I will see you tomorrow morning, Deputy," she said. "Miss Abbott," he said, with a nod that was considerably more formal than he felt. He watched her ride down the main street and turn north, and then he went back into the sheriff's office and sat at his desk and looked at the wall for a moment, and thought about the way her father's name had looked on that land certificate, and the way her hands had shaken just slightly when she picked it up. Then he got up and wrote 3 more letters, because there was still work to do. The deputy marshal arrived on a Thursday, 5 days after the confrontation in the land office, and his name was Roland Fitch, and he was a compact, weathered man who had been doing this work for 17 years, and had the unhurried efficiency of someone who had seen most things and was not surprised by much. He read George's case documentation over 2 hours in the sheriff's office and then looked up and said, "This is a clean piece of work." George said, "I had good evidence." "Evidence doesn't arrange itself," Fitch said. He tapped the affidavit from Jacob Mercer. "How did you know to look at the star count?" "I spent 3 years in the surveyor's office before I took the deputy position," George said. "I've seen the county clerk's seal on more documents than I can count. When I looked at the transfer document, something felt wrong about it. It took me a day to work out what." Fitch nodded. "Colton Briggs is in custody in Las Cruces. The sheriff there picked him up Tuesday morning before he could get to the train." He paused. "Pratt has been cooperating since yesterday. He's given us 3 other properties to look at besides Abbott." George felt the satisfaction of that settle over him like cooling water on a hot day. 3 other families, 3 other forged documents, 3 other stolen lives potentially restored. "I'd like to be kept informed," he said, "about the other claims." "Of course," Fitch said. "I'd also like to talk to you about a position. Not today, but the territorial marshal's office is looking for people who can do this kind of work. People who know land records and have the patience to follow a document trail." He paused again. "You interested?" George said he would think about it, which was true, and thought about it for the rest of the day. He had been riding out to the Abbott homestead every 2 or 3 days since the confrontation with Pratt, always with legitimate professional reasons, verifying the boundary markers, collecting additional documentation for the territorial filing, coordinating with the county clerk's office on the permanent record correction. These reasons were real. They were also not the only reasons. The Abbott homestead was a beautiful piece of land. That was not something George had expected, though he could not have said exactly what he had expected. The house was modest, adobe and timber in the territorial style, with a wide porch that faced west and caught the evening light. The fields were orderly and the fencing was maintained with care. There was a kitchen garden behind the house, and a small orchard of apricot trees that had been planted, Winifred had told him, by her mother in the first year she and Edmund had been on the land, 1877, before Winifred was born. Winifred's mother had died of typhoid fever when Winifred was 8. She had grown up keeping house for her father and learning the work of the land alongside him, and she had absorbed both sets of knowledge with the thoroughness of someone who understood from early on that she would need all of it. On his third visit to the homestead, she had offered him dinner with the same practical matter-of-factness she brought to everything, explaining that she had made a pot of stew that was too much for one person, and that it would be wasteful not to share it. And he had accepted with the same practical matter-of-factness. And they had sat at the kitchen table, while the evening came down over the mesa, and talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. She had asked about his family, which surprised him because he had not been expecting to be asked. He had told her about the farm in Missouri and the drought and the banker, and she had listened with the quality of attention that meant she was actually hearing him rather than waiting for him to finish. And when he was done, she had said, quietly, "So you became a lawman because you could not get the law to work for your family, and you wanted to make it work for someone else's." He had looked at her across the table, and the lamp between them cast warm shadows across her face, and he said, "That is more or less right." "Your father would be proud of you," she said. He had not been expecting that either, and the way it landed in his chest was not something he was prepared to discuss. "He was a good man," George said. "He would have liked the directness of what you said," she smiled. "I come by it honestly. My father had no patience for the long way around a thing. Mine either." They had looked at each other across the lamp, and the evening was very quiet around them, and the weight of something unspoken sat in the room with them like a third presence. "George," she said, which was the first time she had used his name without the deputy attached to it. "Winifred," he said. She looked down at her hands on the table and then back up. "I want to say something that I am not entirely sure how to say." "All right," he said. "What you did for me for my father's land, I am not able to repay that, and I am aware that you did not do it expecting repayment." She paused. "But I also want you to know that I see you clearly, not just what you did but who you are, and who you are is—" She stopped. "Remarkable," she finished, precisely and quietly, as if she had chosen the word after rejecting several others. He did not respond immediately. He turned his coffee cup once in his hands and looked at the table and thought about everything he had been keeping in the professional compartment, and about how much structural integrity that compartment had left. "I am not a simple man," he said finally. "I have a dark past in the sense that I have made choices I regret, and I carry them the way anyone carries things they cannot put down. I have a tendency to be consumed by whatever problem is in front of me, and I have been told that this can make me a difficult person to be close to." He looked up. "I'm telling you this not as a warning. I'm telling you because you said you see me clearly, and I want to make sure you have accurate information." She was very still. "Are you telling me your faults?" "I'm being honest with you. You have just described every person I have ever respected," she said. "People who care about things enough to be consumed by them. People who carry what they carry without putting it on someone else." She tilted her head slightly. "What choices do you regret?" he told her. It was the story of a man named Hardy Kellick, who had been a friend of his in the early years of his deputying, and who had turned out to be running a stolen cattle operation that George had missed for 8 months because he had trusted friendship over professional judgment. When he had finally faced the evidence, he had arrested Kellick himself, and Kellick had been sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison. He had not spoken to Hardy since. But the 8 months haunted him because 3 ranchers had lost cattle they could not afford to lose, and a good man's life had been bent into something unrecognizable, and George had not seen it in time. "You blame yourself," she said. "Some of it is my fault. Most of it isn't. Most isn't all." She thought about this. "My father used to say that the mark of a good person is not that they never fail. It's that failure teaches them something they carry forward. What did Hardy Kellick teach you?" George considered this. To look harder, to not let friendship cloud professional judgment. He paused. To care about the people in front of you without letting that care become a blind spot. "And yet," she said, 3 weeks ago a stranger appeared in the street asking for help with a document fraud and you dropped everything." He looked at her. "That was not a blind spot." "No," she agreed softly. "I don't think it was." That night he rode back to Cutter's Creek under a sky full of stars, and his thoughts were in a state he was not entirely used to, which was to say they were not organized around a problem to be solved, but around something looser and more confusing and considerably warmer, and he decided to let them be that way for the ride home. The next 2 weeks were busy with the legal aftermath of the Pratt case. Fitch and his team worked through the territorial records and identified 4 other fraudulent transfers connected to Briggs and Pratt's scheme. 3 of the affected landowners were still alive and still fighting their claims. The 4th had already left the territory, and there was the sadder work of trying to locate them and inform them that their land could potentially be restored. George coordinated with Fitch's office on the evidentiary documentation for all 4 cases, which meant several long days at the courthouse and several long letters to Santa Fe. And he was also still doing his regular deputy's work, which did not pause for complicated land fraud investigations. Through all of it, Winifred was a constant, not in a way that distracted from the work, but in a way that ran underneath it, like a river under a road that you cannot see but can feel in the slight give of the ground beneath your feet. She came to town twice in that period, once to sign additional affidavits for the territorial filing, and once for a purpose she described as personal business, but which turned out to involve a long conversation with the county clerk about the possibility of improving the record-keeping practices that had allowed Pratt to file a fraudulent document without anyone noticing. George had overheard part of that conversation from the hallway, and he had stood there listening to Winifred Abbott explain to the county clerk, in patient, thorough, relentless detail, exactly what procedural changes would prevent future fraudulent filings, and he had thought, with the kind of clarity that arrives like a light coming on in a dark room, that he was thoroughly and completely in love with her. This was not a comfortable realization. It was the kind that required sitting with, which he did, on the steps of the sheriff's office in the evening, while the last light went off the mesa and the temperature dropped to something bearable, and working out what it meant and what to do about it. What it meant was that the 3 weeks of careful professional distance had been, at least on his end, partly fiction. He had believed in the fiction because it was useful, and because allowing himself to care about a person whose case he was working would have created exactly the kind of blind spot he had learned to guard against. But the case was settled. The land was restored. Briggs was in custody and Pratt was cooperating, and there was no professional barrier left between what he felt and what he could honestly acknowledge. What to do about it was less clear, because Winifred Abbott was a self-sufficient, clear-eyed woman who had given him no explicit indication that what he felt was reciprocal, and he was not a man who assumed things. He thought about the way she had said remarkable, with that particular precision, choosing that word specifically. He thought about the 3 hours at her kitchen table, and the way the conversation had moved between them like something that had been going on for years rather than weeks. He thought about the way she had said his name, George, with the lamp between them. He rode out to the homestead the following Saturday. It was not for professional reasons, and he did not pretend otherwise. He arrived in the morning when the light was still at a low angle and the air was cool, and Winifred came out onto the porch when she heard the horse and stood with her arms crossed, watching him approach with an expression of clear-eyed evaluation. "Deputy," she said, when he had dismounted and tied the horse. "I'm not here as a deputy today," he said. "No," she tilted her head. "Then as what?" He came up the porch steps and stopped at the top, which put them at approximately the same height, and looked at her directly. "As a man who wants to have an honest conversation with you about something that is not professional in nature." Her arms were still crossed. Her expression had not changed, but her eyes had done something he had come to recognize, a slight deepening of attention that meant she was giving the moment her full weight. "All right," she said. He told her. He told her clearly and honestly and without embellishment, which was the only way he knew how to say important things. He told her that over the past 3 weeks, he had come to know her in ways that had changed his understanding of what he was looking for in a life, and that he had come to feel for her something that he had not expected and had not been looking for, and had not been able to set aside by any professional or personal discipline he had tried. He told her that he was not proposing anything specific in this moment, because that was not what this moment called for, but that he wanted her to know where he stood, clearly and without ambiguity, so that she could make whatever decisions she made with accurate information. When he finished, she uncrossed her arms. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "George," she said, "do you know how long it has been since someone spoke to me as if my understanding of the situation mattered?" "You give me the impression," he said carefully, "that it has been too long." "It has been too long," she confirmed. She looked out across the field where her father's wheat was growing, green and steady in the July light. "I have been running this homestead alone for months. I have been fighting for this land alone. And you came along, and the first thing you did was ask me to explain the document, as if you expected my explanation to be useful." She paused. "It sounds like a small thing." "It isn't," he said. "No," she said, "it isn't." She looked back at him. "I have been doing a great deal of thinking in the last 3 weeks, George, about this land and about my father and about what comes next, and a significant portion of that thinking has involved you, which I believe you might have guessed." "I had some evidence," he said. She almost smiled. "I am not a woman who gives her trust easily. My father taught me that it was the most valuable thing a person had, and that it should be given carefully and kept faithfully." She held his gaze. "I think you are a man worth trusting with it," he breathed. "I am not asking for anything immediate," she said, echoing his own words back to him with that dry precision. "But I wanted you to know where I stand, clearly and without ambiguity, so that you can make whatever decisions you make with accurate information." He looked at her, and the morning light was across the whole mesa, and the wheat was moving slightly in the beginning of a breeze, and the apricot trees in the kitchen garden behind the house were thick with summer leaves, and he thought about his mother telling him once that a person knew when a moment mattered because everything in the moment seemed more real than usual, more present, as if the world was paying attention. "Then I think," he said, "that we are standing on the same ground." "I think we are," she agreed. They stood there on the porch for another moment, and then she said, "I made coffee. Do you want some?" "Yes," he said. They went inside. The weeks that followed were unlike anything George had experienced in his professional life, because they were simultaneously the most productive and the most disruptive period he could remember. Productive because the Briggs case was moving efficiently through the territorial courts, and he was working closely with Fitch's office to build the strongest possible evidentiary record. And disruptive because he was also, for the first time in his adult life, actively involved in something that was not his work. He courted Winifred Abbott with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, which meant that he did not rush, did not assume, and paid careful attention to what she actually wanted rather than what he imagined she might want. He asked her questions and listened to the answers. He remembered what she had told him previously and connected it to new things she told him. He brought her books from the town's small lending library, books she mentioned wanting to read, and once, on a whim that surprised him with its confidence, he brought her a particular kind of wild flower that grew along the creek bed north of town, because she had mentioned, in passing, 3 weeks earlier, that she had loved them as a child and had not seen them growing on her section of land. She had looked at the flowers for a moment in silence and then looked at him and said, "You remember things. You say interesting things," he said. "It would be difficult not to." She had put the flowers in a clay pitcher on the kitchen windowsill, and they had been there on each of his subsequent visits, carefully maintained, and he had not said anything about this, but he had noticed. The trial of Colton Briggs began in October in Santa Fe, and George traveled there to testify. He was gone for 6 days, which was the longest he and Winifred had been apart since the beginning of July, and he discovered that absence clarified things considerably. He testified for most of a day, presenting the seal evidence, the affidavit from Mercer, the pattern of fraudulent filings across 4 properties. The territorial prosecutor was competent and the case was solid, and the defense had very little room to work with. Briggs, who was a composed and prosperous-looking man with good tailoring and an expression of permanent, confident calculation, sat at the defense table and looked at George throughout the testimony with the particular attention of someone doing a forensic assessment of an opponent. On the second day of the trial, during a recess, Briggs's attorney approached George in the hallway with an offer, not from Briggs, he was careful to say, but hypothetically as a professional inquiry, which meant from Briggs. The offer was, Briggs would surrender the other 3 contested properties cleanly and without further legal contest, in exchange for a reduction in charges that would significantly decrease his likely prison time. George looked at the attorney for a long moment. "That is a conversation for the territorial prosecutor," he said. "Not for me. And the answer, which I am not authorized to give but am giving anyway, is no." Briggs was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and misuse of official instruments. He was sentenced to 12 years in the territorial prison. Pratt, who had cooperated fully and whose role had been secondary, received 2 years with the possibility of early release. The 3 other contested properties were restored to their rightful owners. George rode home from Santa Fe on the 6th day with the quiet satisfaction of finished work and the more complicated sensation of wanting to be somewhere specific, which was to say on a porch in the North Country looking at a field of wheat that had been saved, with a particular person beside him. He stopped at the homestead before he went back to town. Winifred was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her hat pushed back, working through the late-season maintenance with the systematic thoroughness that was characteristic of her. She looked up when she heard the horse, and when she saw it was him, something happened to her face that she did not try to hide. She set down the tool she was holding and walked to the garden fence and leaned on it and looked at him. "Guilty verdict," he said, dismounting. "I heard," she said. "Walt Ferris has a brother in Santa Fe who telegraphed him yesterday. Good news travels fast. In a small territory, yes." She was looking at him with that steady, evaluating warmth. "Are you all right?" He tied the horse and walked to the fence and stood across it from her. "I am better now than I was 2 hours ago," he said honestly. She reached across the fence and put her hand on his arm briefly with a matter-of-fact tenderness that went straight through him. "Come inside," she said. "I have dinner on the stove and you look like you have been traveling for 6 days." "I have been traveling for 6 days." "Then come inside." He came inside. They had dinner, and then they sat on the west porch and watched the evening come over the mesa, and the light went through orange and rose and deep gold and finally purple, and at some point during the transition from orange to rose George reached over and took her hand, which was resting on the arm of her chair, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that while the stars came up one by one over the eastern ridge. "I've been thinking," he said, after a comfortable while. "About what?" "About the marshal's offer, the position in the territorial office." He felt her attention sharpen slightly. "It would mean working out of Santa Fe most of the time. Traveling across the territory for investigations." He paused. "It would also mean better pay and the ability to do this kind of work on a larger scale." She was quiet for a moment. "What is stopping you from taking it?" "I haven't decided yet," he said. "There are considerations." She looked at him, and in the starlight her eyes were dark and direct. "George, are you making a decision about your professional life on the basis of my proximity to Cutter's Creek?" He looked back at her. "Not solely, but partly." "Yes," he said, "partly. Is that a problem?" "It would be a problem," she said carefully, "if you made a decision that diminished your work and then blamed it on me eventually. But it would not be a problem if you made a decision that made sense for both of us together." She paused. "Together is a word that requires some prior conversation, which we have not entirely had yet." He turned so he was facing her more fully. "Then let's have it. In the way of important conversations that have been anticipated for some time, it was both easier and harder than expected." He told her what he wanted, which was not a small or tentative thing. A life with her, a partnership in the full sense, a home that was theirs and not just his, a future built on the same ground they were already standing on. He told her that he had no interest in changing what she had built here, only in being part of it and in offering what he had in return. She listened with her hand still in his and her face turned toward him in the dark. "I have been alone for a long time," she said when he finished. "I have learned to be self-sufficient because I had to be, and I want you to know that self-sufficiency and wanting a partnership are not contradictory in my mind. I do not need you. I want you. And I think those are different things, and I think the second one matters more." He thought about this. "I agree with you. I also think," she said, "that this land is my home and I am not leaving it, and I want to make sure you understand that before anything else." "I understand it," he said, "and I would not ask you to. If you took the position with the territorial marshal's office," she said, "you would travel. That is the nature of that work." "Yes, I travel," she said. "I went to the county seat twice last month on land record business. I went to Albuquerque in the spring for the agricultural fair. I am not a woman who is going to sit on this porch and worry about you every time you leave. I am going to run this homestead and do my own work and trust you to come back." He felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized was tight. "That," he said, "is exactly the right thing to say." "I know," she said with that dry precision. "I said it because it is true." "Winifred," he said. "George," she said. He kissed her there on the west porch with the stars overhead and the mesa all around them and the autumn evening cool on their faces. And it was the kind of kiss that is not a beginning exactly but a confirmation of everything that has been true for a while and has finally been allowed to be said. She put her hand against his jaw and he felt the roughness of her palm, the practical working hand of a woman who had been doing real work her whole life, and he thought that it was the most honest thing anyone had ever touched him with. When they separated, she looked at him with those amber eyes and said, "You are going to write to the marshal tomorrow and accept the position." "Are you telling me or asking me?" "Telling you," she said. "It is the right position for you and you know it." "I know it," he admitted. "Good," she said. "Then that is settled." George wrote to Marshal Fitch the following morning and accepted the position, effective after a 6-week transition period during which he would train his replacement in Cutter's Creek. The transition period was, in retrospect, exactly the right amount of time, long enough to do the job properly and short enough that it did not become a kind of limbo. His replacement was a young man named Thomas Reeves, who was 24 and serious and good with records, which George considered the essential quality for a deputy in a territory where land fraud was apparently a thriving industry. He spent 6 weeks teaching Reeves everything he knew, not just the procedural knowledge but the observational habits, the way of looking at a document that caught the things that were slightly wrong, the pattern recognition that came from years of working with paper and people. Reeves was an apt student, and by the end of the 6 weeks George felt confident in leaving him to it. In November, on a Saturday morning with the first cold front of the season moving down from the north, George Donovan and Winifred Abbott were married in the small Methodist church in Cutter's Creek, with Sheriff Beaumont as a witness and Walt Ferris and his wife Mabel on the other side, and a congregation of roughly 40 people who had known Edmund Abbott and were disposed to feel warmly toward his daughter's happiness. Winifred wore a dress she had made herself, a deep cream-colored wool with simple lines, and she had let her dark hair down except for a twist at the back that she had pinned with a small amber comb that had been her mother's. She stood beside George at the front of the church and looked at him with those direct, amber eyes, and when the minister asked if she would take this man, she said yes in a clear, steady voice that carried to the back row. He looked at her when he said his vows and said them to her specifically, not to the room or the occasion but to her, and she held his gaze the whole time. Afterward, there was a gathering at the sheriff's office, which was the largest indoor space available, with food that the neighboring women had contributed, including Mabel Ferris's famous apple cake and a venison roast from the proprietor of the feed store, who turned out to be a considerable cook. The fiddle player from the main street, whose name was Danny Ortega, and who was genuinely talented when he was not having a bad day, played for 2 hours without a single catastrophic wrong note, and someone pushed the desks back and there was dancing. George danced with Winifred, who danced with the same decisive competence she brought to everything, and she laughed when he stepped slightly wrong on a turn, a real laugh, open and unguarded, and he pulled her back in and said, "I'm a better deputy than I am a dancer," and she said, "You are a better dancer than you think you are," and they finished the dance without further incident. They drove back to the homestead that evening in a wagon George had borrowed, with the stars coming up over the cold mesa and a blanket over their laps against the November chill, and Winifred tucked against his side with her head on his shoulder, which was where she fit with the particular rightness of things that have found their correct place. "My father would have liked you," she said, into his coat. He put his arm around her. "Tell me what he was like," she told him, all the way home. The homestead expanded in the following years, with the kind of deliberate, practical growth that characterized everything Winifred undertook. In the spring of 1885, she planted 20 additional apricot trees in the orchard her mother had started, and she hired a second ranch hand, a quiet Navajo man named Hosea who knew the land and the weather in the way that people who have lived alongside something for generations know it, which was to say deeply and intuitively. She added 40 acres of alfalfa to the crop rotation, which improved the soil and gave her a secondary market with the cavalry post 20 miles north. George worked the territorial position, which required him to travel for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, sometimes more. He investigated fraud cases and document disputes, and the specific, elaborate corruptions that developed wherever land and money intersected and oversight was thin. He was good at the work in the way that people are good at things they care about from the inside, and his reputation in the territorial office grew steadily. When he came home between assignments, he came home to the homestead, which had become his home in the fullest sense, not just as a place he returned to, but as a place he thought about when he was away. The smell of the kitchen garden and the sound of the wind across the wheat fields, and the way the evening light came over the west porch where they sat together when the day's work was done. He brought her things from his travels, a particular kind of pepper from the markets in Albuquerque that she had mentioned wanting, a book of botanical illustration from a shop in Santa Fe, a piece of blue pottery from a Pueblo craftsman near Taos that he had bought on instinct, and that she placed on the kitchen windowsill next to where the wildflowers had once stood in their clay pitcher. She wrote him letters when he was away. They were long letters, practical and detailed about the homestead business, funny in the dry way that was characteristic of her. And then, at the end, they were tender in the specific, honest way of a person who did not use tenderness carelessly, and therefore made it count when they did. He kept the letters in a bundle in his saddlebag, and read them more than once on long evenings in territorial hotels. He wrote her back letters that were similarly long, and he discovered in the writing of them that he had things to say that he had never previously had the occasion or the inclination to say, and that the saying of them clarified something in him, made him more legible to himself. In the autumn of 1885, Winifred told him she was expecting their first child, sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening with the lamp between them as it had been that first long evening, and she told him in the straightforward way she told him everything, and then watched his face. He was quiet for a moment that was not a hesitation but a full arrival of the information and what it meant. "Are you well?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "I have felt well from the beginning, which is apparently a good sign." "When?" "April," she said. "Dr. Haverford in town estimates April." He reached across the table and took her hands in both of his. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at him, and her expression was the kind that was not quite describable, something between joy and gravity, as if she was holding the full weight of the thing rather than only its lightness. "April," he said. "Yes." "Then I will arrange to be home from February through May," he said. "At least." She raised an eyebrow. "That is more than 2 months." "Winifred," he said, with a steadiness that was not an argument but a statement of fact, "I am going to be here." She looked at him for a moment, and something in her face softened in a way it almost never did, a deeper vulnerability than she usually allowed herself, and she said, "I know you are." Their son was born on the 7th of April, 1886, in the early morning hours when the spring sky was going from black to dark blue. Dr. Haverford had come out from town the previous day, when it became clear that the time was close, and he was a competent and calm professional who stayed out of the way when he was not needed, and was there completely when he was. George was with her through all of it, because that was where he was going to be, and he discovered in those hours something about the particular quality of Winifred Abbott's endurance that he had not previously understood, which was that it was not the absence of pain, but the decision to move through it. And watching her make that decision over and over again over several hours was one of the most significant things he had witnessed in his life. They named the boy Edmund, after her father. Edmund Donovan arrived in the world with considerable vocal opinions about the experience and a head of dark hair and eyes that in the early weeks were the undecided dark blue of a new person working out what color they intended to be, and that eventually settled, around 2 months old, into a warm amber brown that was unmistakably his mother's. "He has your eyes," George said, one evening in June, holding the baby on the west porch while Winifred sat beside him in the other chair with her coffee, the sunset doing its usual spectacular work over the mesa. "He has your expression," she said, "that particular look of determined evaluation. He has been giving it to me all day." George looked at the baby. The baby looked back at him with the amber-brown eyes and the expression of determined evaluation. "Hello," George said. Edmund blinked. "He is not yet impressed," Winifred said. "He will be," George said. She looked at the two of them, her husband and her son, in the evening light on the porch her father had built, and felt the full weight of the life she had held on to. George returned to his territorial position in August, when Edmund was 4 months old and firmly established in his routines, and in the deepest part of Winifred's already organized heart. The letters between them continued, and now Edmund featured in them, his developments reported with the same precise observation Winifred brought to everything, so that George was aware of his son's first attempts at something approaching laughter, and his decided preference for a particular blue blanket, and his ongoing complex relationship with the family's barn cat, who regarded him with cautious curiosity. George came home as often as the work allowed, and when he was home, he was completely present in the way that people are who have learned to inhabit a place fully rather than just occupying it. The year 1887 brought two significant changes. The first was that George was promoted to Deputy Chief Investigator for the Territorial Marshal's Office, which brought increased responsibility, and also, to his private satisfaction, the authority to prioritize the cases he investigated. He used this authority, in part, to ensure that the three other homesteaders who had been affected by Briggs and Pratt's scheme had fully recovered their properties and their standing with the Territorial Land Office. He also used it to push forward a proposal, which he had been developing for 2 years, for a standardized seal verification system for the entire territory, so that what had been done to the Abbott homestead could not be done to anyone else. The proposal was adopted in the spring of 1887, and a small notice about it appeared in the Santa Fe New Mexican under the heading Territorial Land Reform, which was not the kind of recognition that generated celebrations, but was the kind that lasted. The second change was that Winifred, who had been expanding the homestead's alfalfa operation with impressive efficiency, entered into a formal business arrangement with the cavalry post that provided a reliable quarterly income, supplementing the crop revenue. She negotiated the contract herself in the cavalry post commander's office, with a combination of thorough preparation and direct communication that resulted in terms more favorable than the commander had apparently intended to offer, which he mentioned to George at a social gathering months later with an expression of rueful admiration. George had not been surprised. He had only smiled and said, "She is a thorough negotiator." In the autumn of 1887, Winifred mentioned, in her characteristically practical way, that Edmund might benefit from a sibling. "He has developed a very strong sense of his own opinions," she said, "and I believe that the social development offered by a brother or sister would be healthy for him." "Is this your way of telling me something?" George asked, "or is this a proposal?" "It is a proposal," she said, "for your consideration." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the lamplight. She had her hair down, which she rarely wore during working hours, and the lamp made amber of her eyes and warm shadow of everything else, and she was watching him with that steady, warm, evaluating attention. "My answer," he said, "is yes." Their daughter, Clara, arrived in the spring of 1889, with a headful of red-brown hair that belonged to no one anyone could immediately account for, and then was traced, after some family discussion, to George's maternal grandmother, who had apparently been a redhead of considerable presence. Clara shared her brother's amber eyes and her father's expression of determined evaluation, and she arrived in the world with, if anything, even stronger opinions than Edmund had managed, which Winifred observed with a satisfaction that George suspected was not entirely objective. Edmund, who was 3 years old, received his sister with a careful, assessing inspection that lasted approximately 2 minutes, followed by a declaration that she was acceptable, following which he went back to his ongoing investigation of the barn cat's sleeping patterns, which remained the great project of his scientific life. The homestead in those years had become something that Edmund Abbott, who had come to New Mexico territory with $40 and a mule, would have recognized as the fulfillment of the thing he had been trying to build. The fields were productive and the fencing was sound, and the house had been added to. A second bedroom and a larger kitchen and a proper porch with good chairs, and there was laughter in it, and real work, and the kind of marriage that is built on the bedrock of two people who have chosen each other with full information and genuine respect. George was home more as the children grew, partly by design and partly because his reputation in the territorial office had reached a point where he could exercise meaningful choice about assignments. He took the cases that required his specific expertise and declined those that were routine, and the balance shifted gradually toward more time on the homestead, which was where he wanted to be. He taught Edmund to ride when the boy was 5, on a steady, patient quarter horse mare named Juniper, in the south pasture where the ground was flat. Edmund took to it with the same determined intensity he brought to everything, and within a summer was cantering with a confidence that made Winifred watch from the fence with one hand over her heart, which she would have denied if anyone had mentioned it. He taught Clara, 2 years later on the same patient Juniper, and discovered that his daughter had a natural ease with horses that went beyond instruction, something instinctive and physical, and that she was going to be an exceptional rider, which she proved comprehensively and without particular interest in praise for it. Winifred taught them both to read, from the collection of books that had accumulated on the homestead shelves over the years, her father's agricultural texts and George's law books from his deputy years, and the botanical illustrations, and a dozen novels and histories that had come home in saddlebags from Santa Fe and Albuquerque and Las Cruces. She taught them with the same deliberate thoroughness she brought to everything, and Edmund was reading chapter books by the time he was 6, and Clara was reading them by 5.5, which she considered merely accurate rather than remarkable. The land itself, which had been the center of everything, remained so. The apricot trees that Winifred's mother had planted in 1877 were now, in 1893, full-grown and prolific, and in the summer they produced fruit in quantities that Winifred processed into preserves and dried fruit and occasional brandy, the last of which was a skill her father had taught her, and which George considered one of her less advertised but significant accomplishments. The wheat fields rotated with alfalfa, and a small section of kitchen garden that had expanded over the years into something genuinely impressive, running along the whole south side of the house, with the kind of productive abundance that made summer dinners possible on almost everything grown within a quarter-mile of the house. In the spring of 1894, George wrote his formal retirement from the territorial marshal's office, which was a letter he drafted 3 times before he was satisfied with it, not because he was unsure about the decision, but because he wanted the document to accurately reflect what the work had meant to him. The deputy chief investigator who replaced him was a woman named Doller Cerna, which was not something that had been imaginable when George had taken the position 9 years before, and which he considered one of the genuinely good developments of that 9 years. On his last day in the Santa Fe office, Fitch, who was now the chief marshal and had grown considerably grayer in the years since the Briggs case, shook his hand and said, "You changed how this office works." "The seal verification system," George said. "Among other things," Fitch said. George rode home for the last time as a territorial officer on a May morning, with the mountains still carrying snow on their high ridges and the lower country green from spring rains. And he thought about a Tuesday morning 10 years before when a woman had appeared in the street and asked him for help with a forged document. He arrived at the homestead in the afternoon. Edmund, who was 8, was in the south pasture working through a mathematics problem that his mother had set for him that morning, sitting cross-legged in the grass with his slate and a determined expression. Clara, who was 5, was in the apricot orchard engaged in a project that appeared to involve the barn cat and a very patient attitude toward being ignored. Winifred was on the west porch. She was sitting in her chair with a book open in her lap, though George suspected she had not been reading for at least the last 10 minutes, because she was looking toward the north road, which was the direction from which anyone coming from Santa Fe would arrive. When she saw him come around the bend, she closed the book and set it on the arm of the chair and stood up. He dismounted and tied the horse to the rail and came up the porch steps, and she was there at the top in a plain house dress with her dark hair pinned up in the May light on her face. And she was 43 years old now, and the years had done what years do, put lines in her face and a few threads of silver in her hair, and she was more beautiful to him than she had been the day he met her, because the years were visible in her, and the years were the story of everything she had done and endured and chosen. "Deputy Donovan," she said, with that precision that still carried after 10 years the warmth of a private joke between them, "Former deputy," he said, "as of this morning." She looked at him. "How does it feel?" He considered this. "Right," he said. "It feels right." She reached up and straightened the collar of his coat, which was a gesture she had developed over the years and which he knew was not about the collar, and he put his hand over hers and held it there for a moment. "Come on," she said. "I have dinner starting and Edmund needs someone to check his arithmetic." "How is his arithmetic?" "Excellent," she said. "He will not believe it until you tell him." And Clara. The cat has moved from the orchard to the woodpile, and Clara is reconsidering her strategic approach. She will be fine. She looked at him with the smile that had not changed at all, warm and unguarded and entirely real. "George, Winifred," he said. "Welcome home," she said. He held her face in his hands and kissed her on the west porch of the house that Edmund Abbott had built in 1876, with the May light all around them, and the smell of the kitchen garden, and the sound of his son arguing in the distance with the mathematics problem that he was absolutely going to solve, and in the apricot orchard his daughter reconsidering her tactical options with characteristic determination, and the land stretching out in all directions. 160 acres of proved-up homestead under a clean territorial sky. He kissed her and she put her hands against his chest and kissed him back. "Edmund needs his arithmetic checked," she said, against his mouth. "In a moment," he said. She laughed, the real open laugh, and he thought that after 10 years it still landed in him like that sweet sliding phrase on the fiddle, perfect and immediate and exactly right. They went inside. Edmund's arithmetic was, as Winifred had known, excellent. George sat with him at the kitchen table and went through the problems while Winifred finished dinner, and Edmund, who had his mother's thorough attention and his father's deliberate precision, explained his working out each problem with a seriousness of purpose that George found genuinely impressive and also very familiar. "That's right," George told him on the third problem. Edmund looked at the answer he had written and then looked up at his father. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew." George looked at his son, who had his mother's eyes and his father's expression and apparently his own particular brand of confident precision, and felt something he had no adequate word for, something that was partly recognition and partly wonder and entirely love. "I knew," he said. "I was confirming for both of us." Edmund considered this and nodded, satisfied. Clara came in from the orchard while dinner was being put on the table, with grass in her hair, and an expression of having resolved whatever strategic question had required resolution, and she sat down in her chair and looked at her father across the table with the amber eyes and the determined expression. "The cat," she announced, "has been convinced." "Well done," George said. "I know," Clara said. The evening came down over the mesa in the long, slow way of May evenings, all orange and rose and deep gold, and the five of them sat at the table together. And dinner was the venison that Hosea had brought earlier that week, and the bread that Winifred had made that morning, and the preserved apricots from the summer before. And the conversation ranged across Edmund's arithmetic and Clara's ongoing campaign for an additional cat and George's account of his last day in the Santa Fe office, and what the mountains had looked like with the snow still on them, and the lamp made a warm circle in the room against the darkening outside. After the children were in bed and the dishes were done, Winifred and George sat on the west porch in the chairs that had held 100 evenings between them, and the stars were out in the clear May sky, and the land was dark and quiet around them. "Are you happy?" she asked. It was not a question she asked often, because she paid enough attention that she usually knew, but this was a different kind of moment. He looked at the sky and at the dark line of the mesa, and at the lamplit kitchen window where the blue pottery sat on the sill. "Profoundly," he said. She reached over in the dark and found his hand, and he held it, and the night was around them, and the land was theirs, and everything that had been fought for and proved and built and loved was present in the quiet. The forged seal that had almost taken all of it was a footnote in a territorial record in Santa Fe. Silas Pratt had finished his 2 years and moved east, to somewhere without land fraud opportunities or people with George Donovan's SEAL expertise. Colton Briggs had served 9 of his 12 years before dying in the territorial prison of a fever in 1895, which was not a tragedy George spent time on, though he noted it when the letter arrived. The 4 families whose land had been contested were all on their properties. George knew this because he had made it his business to follow up over the years, and because the work of protecting people's rights did not stop being interesting just because it was no longer his official job. He remained, in an informal and voluntary capacity, a resource for the county clerk's office on document verification questions, which were occasional but important, and which kept his skills from going entirely dormant. The Abbott homestead, which was now the Donovan homestead as well, though Winifred still called it by her father's name in the way that mattered, was a functioning, productive, living place, and it was going to be for as long as the family was in it. Winifred had planted 3 more apricot trees that spring on the south edge of the orchard to replace 3 that had died in the hard winter of 1892. She had chosen a slightly different variety, one that a neighbor had introduced from a nursery in Albuquerque, and the new trees had caught with the determined vitality of things that have been put in the right place at the right time. "What are you thinking about?" George asked in the dark on the porch. "The new trees," she said. "I think they are going to do very well this summer." "I think so too," he said, though he had not given the trees any particular thought until this moment. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The stars moved over the mesa in their old, reliable patterns, the same patterns that had been there when Edmund Abbott had arrived with his $40 and his mule, the same patterns that would be there long after all of this was memory and record. The land was dark and the house was lit and the children were sleeping and the work of the day was done, and it would begin again tomorrow, with the same deliberate care and the same honest commitment that had built it all in the first place. George Donovan looked at the stars and at the dark land, and at the woman beside him who had walked into a street 3 weeks before a deadline with her father's land certificate in her bag, and refused to accept that what was hers could be taken from her, and he thought about the particular and irreplaceable thing that was a life built correctly on honest ground with the right person doing work that mattered. The night was warm and quiet. The land was theirs. The story, as the best stories do, continued.